Excuse me, so if I could have everybody please take their seats so that we can start our next discussion, our next panel. Thank you. So for our next panel on international aspects of the productivity slowdown, we have, again, three very distinguished speakers. Filippo Di Mauro, who is a visiting professor at the Business School at the National University of Singapore, and also an external consultant at of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. We have also Jose de Gregorio, who's a non-resident senior fellow here at the Institute. He's also a full professor at the University of Chile, and he was the governor of the Central Bank of Chile from 2007 to 2011. And finally, as a discussant, we have Olivier Jean, who is a senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute and also a professor of economics at Johns Hopkins University. So if I could ask Filippo Mauro to please take the stage, and then each speaker will talk for 20 minutes, the discussant 15, and then we'll all move to the podium afterwards. Thank you.
So good morning. Good morning. So this is really a great concept of a conference, and I'm really glad that we were involved since the early stage from Adam and Jeronim to this project. So thanks for the invitation, and I will present something that we prepared with Gianmarco Taviano, who is here and will respond to questions also with me later. So we were asked by the organizers to sort of think about the issue of trade. So what are the implications of the productivity slowdown on the trade? And we have been concentrating on the export side. So the research question that we have, and the story that I'm going to tell you, is how the firm level sort of analysis and data can help us out to respond to this question. The research question, in fact, is the distribution, actually, of firm productivity associated with sectoral export performance across countries. How can firm-level analysis help us out understanding the possible sort of developments of export going forward? And in particular, what are the sort of the features of the firm-level distribution of productivity that matters for the performance of the export sector? So to do so, we will have some analysis, which is actually correlation analysis. We are not so ambitious, but we will present and use data that are coming from the Competitiveness Research Network, sort of an European initiative that I will describe shortly, which is based on firm-level data that we use. And our ambition is to make sure that, I was mentioning to our chair before, to make sure that actually the firm level is associated as much as possible with macro information in order to have really the full picture. So what is first sort of the research network I'm talking about, the component? So just one slide quickly on description, because they are not just data, it's also a community of researchers which are united by this sort of aim of understanding what are the drivers of productivity, and particularly taking a firm level perspective. What we have is a data set that we have been putting together, which is actually quite unique in terms of coverage for countries. We have about 20 EU countries, and also cross-country comparability. We have firm-level data which are actually comparable across, because we use homogeneous sort of methodologies to construct it. The way we do it is actually we have sort of state individual teams. We provide the codes to these teams, and these teams run their sort of with their own data, firm level data, which are millions of data, the same routines, and therefore producing productivity indicators and drivers of productivity. So the data are then aggregated, but at the sector level, we have 60 sectors, but they are very rich. They continue to be rich because we have, for all the variables, we have the entire sort of moments of the distribution. And also, what we have is also covariances between sort of this distribution, say, of productivity and various specific drivers. Okay, so that's the main thing I want to tell you on the data set. So let me just briefly say what is, say, a distribution of productivity, how it looks in our database. And let me spend 1 minute to explain better what is this. So we have the countries on the left-hand side, and these are TFP levels. So the red point is, in fact, the mean or the total factor productivity, and the other one is actually the median. So a couple of observations. So in the sort of the whatever is the yellow green. I'm colorblind. I guess it's the green. So is actually the range of the TFP from low productive to high productive firms. So there are a couple of observations I want to sort of highlight here. First of all, the mean is relatively divaricated, so distant with respect to the median. It means that actually the distribution of productivity is in fact not a normal, but is actually an asymmetric or a Pareto. And also, there is quite a diversification of how these distributions are skewed somehow. No? So you have, for instance, the case of Italy, ITA, in which you see that the median and the mean is relatively close, so it's more symmetric, and the skew, in fact, of the distribution is relatively low. You look instead of Spain, which has exactly the thing, the opposite. So you have really the distribution tends to be rather skew and really more far from symmetric than the other. So what I'm going to sort of point out is that this differentiation in the distribution actually matters a lot when you are going to have, or you try to have a view on what is the export going forward. Okay, so. So let me give you just a few stylized facts on the relation export and productivity, and then I will sort of, I will tell you how we elaborate the data in order to create, to sort of forecast, to understand what are the real drivers of the export performance. So first of all, what I'm going to show you is in our data set how the export are related to the productivity for the various sort of range of the decile of productivity. So what you have, for instance, up front in Belgium, say on the northwest corner, you have sort of the various decile of productivity. So from 0, least productive, to 10, most productive firms, and you have on the y side, on the y-axis, the exports in level. Okay, so the first observation, which is obvious, is that the level of export is positively correlated with the sort of the productivity. So the highest, the most productive are the firms, the more likely are to export more. This is valid for all the countries, although with lots of variation and differentiation across, which is the critical thing. And it's valid also if we compute it in terms of export growth. So even export growth and the productivity deciles are in fact positively correlated. Now, this is actually looking at sort of countries, but the same is also valid by looking at sector across countries. So if you look at this, so the other stylized fact is that the same positive correlation, a significant positive correlation, it exists also if you analyze, say, sector 10, 13, whatever. These are 60 sectors, manufacturing and services, and you have a really significant correlation also across sectors. Okay, so this is just to give you a sense of what are the stylized facts. But now, so what we have is therefore that we have this positive correlation. Now, what we saw also is that there is quite a remarkable differentiation across countries and sectors. What we want to tell you is how we utilize this differentiation in order to have sort of some view on the export performance across countries and across sectors. Now, there is a traditional macro story that was telling us that what it matters is actually the average productivity. So the average productivity, so the first moment of the distribution, will determine sectoral productivity, and this in terms will determine the export. And now the new view that is being developed in the last few years, Gianmarco and others have been leading this research, is the fact that the higher moments are in fact important. So in particular, the asymmetry of distribution, how skewed is the distribution, is very important going forward. The concept is actually very much related to this, the story of Mellitz. So first of all, the firm productivity, sorry, is actually not a normal. So there is, in order to be an exporter, you need to be productive enough to sort of afford this, you know, sort of iceberg cost to enter into the market. But what it matters is actually very much that you have sort of a more sort of export orientation. The larger is the right tail of the distribution. So what is very important is to have a right tail of higher productive and therefore more firms that can afford to be in the export. So that's basically the higher moment I'm going to concentrate on. So, but if we want to actually get into the detail and do some econometrics on the export versus a set of determinants, we run with, you know, in a lot of problems. In fact, the last, most recent literature has developed sort of some strategy in order to sort of solve this issue. And what we're going to do is, in fact, using a more relatively advanced, but by now well-known, two-stage approach to sort of compute an export equation. And this is actually, there will be a first stage in which you have a gravity regression, which will basically filter the distance, the trade friction, the classical gravity sort of factors to explain the bilateral export flow, and then out of that derive an export competitiveness, so what it makes a country particularly good to export. Then, in the second stage, what we do is we actually regress this export competitiveness sort of fixed effect versus a set of moments of the productivity distributions, in particular, both the mean as well as other moments that we will see are very important, in fact, to explain the issue. So let me sort of just point this regression is, again, relatively standard. The important thing here is that we are putting together data that are in the baseline, include all bilateral export flows from OECD countries, so these are macro data, in fact, to destination countries, so these are bilateral trade sort of flows for several manufacturing sectors from 2001 to 2012. And we include actually both component EU sort of states as well as US and China as destination countries. The estimation is actually, again, as I said, relatively standard. We have this equation of export for each sector, and there is an element of origin year fixed effect, the alpha, which we call the export competitiveness index. Then we have beta destination year fixed effects, and then other effects related to trade cost variables. So the bottom line is, out of this, we want to derive is the measure of competitiveness alpha, which is sort of a measure which nets out sort of the importer specific and country per specific characteristics. But you know what we want to do is actually derive this competitiveness and then go ahead in the second round. I'm going to skip this. In the second round, what we do is we regress this export competitiveness versus the various moments of the distribution. Now, the important element that I want to add here is that not only the mean, but also a couple of indicators of asymmetry of the distribution, and we use actually two sort of proxy. One is a skewness index, another one is a Pearson second skewness coefficient. So these are the way we measure. But say you believe that these are actually a reasonable way of measuring asymmetry, and what we do, we use this as that sort of correlates in our equation that we estimate. So this is the second stage equation that we have. We have on the one hand the competitiveness index, which we have derived from the previous stage, and then this is made as a function of the TFP, the mean of the TFP. Then there is log firms, because there is so now we take the exporter's perspective, so the supplier perspective. So therefore, you insert the log firms because it's the number of firms which are from the exporting side, just the size of the country. An indicator of cost, wages, and most importantly, this indicator of asymmetry. So we put, again, here, we have two elements of the productivity distribution, the mean as well as the asymmetry, okay? So what are the results? The results are those ones, too complicated to read in a summary, but look at column 5 and column 6. So these are sort of all significant, and I have actually, for your convenience, consolidated these results here. Believe me that these are right. So what are telling us these results? We're telling us that this competitiveness, country competitiveness sort of index we have developed before is actually a function of the average productivity, which is, again, in the macro literature was considered the factor to consider, but is also a function of the two asymmetry index we consider, relatively, actually even stronger relevance of this asymmetry index. So the bottom line, therefore, is that what we have demonstrated, sort of very, very quickly just in a regression way, that, in fact, to approximate the export performance, you need to have both the mean as well as the distribution of the probability, of the productivity. So it means, from the graph that we saw before, is that the larger is actually the tail that you have on the right-hand side. So the more the concentration of firms which are on the most productive front, the more likely is that you're going to have an export performance aggregated at a sector or country, which is actually more positive, right? So that's the bottom line story. Now, but how do we use this sort of going forward? What is the message that we get? Well, so in principle, you say, well, you want to have a more skewness. So this would be the most reasonable thing. But is the skewness always a good thing? That's the bottom line, no? So the skewness means that you have a sort of a coexistence of firms which are extremely high productive, and there are many, and also firms which are very low productive. But is this a result of a good or a bad allocation of resources? So what we need to do is to add another component, which is, let's measure what is the resource misallocation, or better say, is the allocative efficiency good in these countries, in these sectors? So what we need is an extra concept, and I'm sorry if I add another concept, but we need a concept of allocative efficiency, okay? So what we do is to measure this concept of allocative efficiency, we use what is called in this literature the Ollie-Empirics, which is nothing else than a covariance. So if you measure the aggregate productivity and you decompose the aggregate productivity, you have one part of the productivity which is unweighted part, which is related to the whole sector basically going up, in the same way, and you have a covariance, which is in fact the sort of the product of the productivity of the most productive firms and their size. So in principle, what you want to have, what this indicator will tell you, is that you have allocative efficiency, good allocative efficiency, as long as the most productive firms become larger. So you want to have a system which actually push structural issues are resolved. There is, good flows of resources going from least to most productive. So therefore, the firm which are the most productive will become even larger, and therefore, by doing so, enlarging or increasing the aggregate productivity of the system. Now, to conclude on this, so we want to, at this point, check what is the relationship between this concept of allocative efficiency and the asymmetry we were talking about before. So we ran a regression to basically look at this, and we see that, in fact, these are positively correlated. So somehow, we have that the larger asymmetry, so the skewness of this of the productivity distribution is actually associated with sort of better allocation of resources. However, what is very important to underline here is that this is not is a concept that is valid on average, but what is very important, and the data will tell you very precisely, is that country by country is very different, this correlation. So you may have countries which have sort of high correlation, so in the sense that the skewed will mean effectively a better allocative efficiency, countries in which this is not true. So basically, the bottom line of our discourse is that you cannot really generalize too much your message in terms of the relation between export and productivity, because it's really something that you have to look at, specifically at the data. So that's the bottom line message. So in a sense, okay, so in conclusion, therefore, the story that we want to tell is that, first of all, I hope I make a point on saying that higher moments of the distribution, and in particular the skew of the distribution, so how much you have the tail fat, in the sense that you have sort of more firms which are actually the most productive in terms of, are on the right-hand side, is actually an important component to explain the aggregate export performance of a country or a sector. That is the first thing. The second thing is that also this asymmetry or this skewness is actually associated with a higher allocative efficiency. Now, if we go into sort of and we come back into the theme of the conference, so what is the story that we are going to tell at this time? Basically, we're saying that you may have slower productivity, but you are not necessarily need to be associated with slower export, because this will depend really upon what is the conditions, say in the structure, in the sector, in a country, which are actually conducive or not for a better or not optimal allocation of resources. So the allocation of resources and measuring this allocation of resources at the firm level is critical in order to sort of have a view on the export performance. So what therefore we are going to we are saying, and this is the last sort of point, is that in a sense we are not giving you sort of a trade. So you forecasted a lower productivity. Peterson gave us actually an exact number of what is going to be the productivity slowdown. Unfortunately, as far as we are concerned, we are not going to give you sort of a forecast on what is going to be, given this productivity slowdown, the export performance. But I think we have been providing you some instruments to think about more in detail of what are the underlying factors for the export going forward. In particular, actually, the message was, even if you do a macro analysis, look at the firm level, because the firm level actually can tell you lots of more information about the structure of the economy than you can by using only aggregate information. And then the last call is that we have developed out of millions and millions of firm level data a huge data set, and this huge data set is actually available for researchers. And so you're really looking forward to have you join in the club and use our data for research or policy work. Thank you very much.
Well, okay. Good morning. Well, it's a pleasure to be here again after such a long trip last night. So I'm a bit sleepy still. When I started this project, I was asked what should be the consequences of a productivity slowdown on emerging markets productivity growth. And you say, well, the first thing that you think is that there is a lot to catch up. So there's a wide gap, so you just need to close the gap. And the issue is how the international context will help you to close the gap. And even we know that, and this is, where should I? Which one is it? It's that. Okay. There shows. So, but my main concern was, and this is where I spend then most of the time, I said, well, what's the gap? And I found, just to summarize, a very important result, and that I didn't know was so broad, is that there has been in emerging markets, which is by a sample, because emerging markets are the successful countries among developing countries. They were all developing countries 30 years ago, but they haven't catch up. There has been income convergence, but there has been not TFP convergence. There has been TFP divergence. So that's, I think, that I will first start with an introduction. I will show the main result, and then I'll try to go on with other things, and for me were not that obvious, perhaps. So I spend most of my time. So this is the IMF projections 5 years ahead in 2012 and 2017, and it is clear that there is slowdown. There is an old set of countries, and there is this sample of 39 countries that is on the back of the paper. I want to refine it a little bit more, but of emerging market economies. But you know but the long-term growth 5 years ahead today is almost 1.5 percentage point less than what it was 5 years before in 2012. So in 2012, it was expected that this set of emerging markets would have been growing 1.5% more than what they are expected they will be growing in 2022. The difference, and this is important, all the time, in order to avoid the China and the Brazil problem, which is they are too big, all my average are simple average. Except I should do everything with a median, but I just take simple average. So China is the same as Chile. So the first 3 letters at least. So this is the main result. This is the main, and what I see. This is TFP growth, and this is GDP growth. The dotted lines are GDP growth. And you see that the red line, which are emerging markets, is on average above the world economy, which is the blue line. And indeed, the growth, this is since 1955, growth, this is done with Penn-Wall tables 9.0. Growth in emerging markets have been 4.8. Growth in advanced economies have been 3.8. So, this is point. However, if you see a TFP, the red line is below the blue line. I didn't know. Since 1955, except for some brief periods, it has been below. And an important period is the commodity boom, and the issues where the commodity boom kind of masks some or creates some artificial increase in productivity. But overall, we see that the productivity growth in advanced economies, this is the average of the advanced economies defined by the IMF, it's like 15 countries, is 1.2%. In emerging markets is 0.6%. So I could just go and say, this is it. So now I will do it. I will look closer to the output gaps and how they decompose in factors and in productivity. So the first thing is just to take countries and to say, this is convergence. This is, I do 1990, 2014. I do 1990 to avoid all the discussion of the debt crisis, because in 1980, there were many countries in unsustainable booms, and there are much more countries because of the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1990. We can go to 1980, but there's not such a big difference. But what we see here is that 31 out of the 39 countries have converged, which is they start with some level of GDP in 1990, GDP with respect to the US, and they got closer to the US 24 years later, so a quarter of a century. Okay, on average for these countries, they were 31% of per capita GDP of the US, PPP adjusted and all of those things, and in 2014 was 39%. Okay, some notable cases, of course, Korea and Taiwan. I have some countries that used to be emerging that now are developed countries, so that's also, I think, that's useful. Korea and Taiwan, Korea was 33% of GDP, then was 67, 24 years later, and Taiwan was 40 and went to 80. So this is extremely successful. The Czech Republic is also classified, and there is also Greece, that there are countries that are closer to the US. Here there is Chile, Malaysia, and Poland that have done well, going from 25 to 40. So there has been a relevant catch-up. Let's look now what's happened with capital. Well, there's one case that I will mention, but it's difficult to find. Mexico. I always made this comment about Mexico. Mexico in 1994 had NAFTA, and it hasn't converged. It has diverged with advanced economies. And in any metric, I will make some comments about Mexico, because I think that's very interesting. This is the capital stock. Again, the capital stock is the same. Most countries grow, has converged with the US in terms of, if you measure just capital per capita in a country and capital per capita in the US, that has been convergence. Okay, most countries, of course, Venezuela is doing pretty bad, and then you have here, but then you have almost the same. China is also an interesting case. It went from 6% to 4%, and it's in a way a bit outlier. Okay, but we have all countries with a lot of investment, okay, and with a lot of capital catch-up. If we look at human capital, this measure as a standard with Mincer equation and with the schooling, we have that this is much more homogeneous. All of them have catch-up a little bit. So I don't want, I like to see things in two-axis things and no regressions. This is kind of very clear. So let's see at productivity. So here is TFP. Okay, TFP that has not been catch up. Most countries have diverged with respect to the US. Even we have the most successful, for example, Korea, a little bit of catch-up. And this reminds me, of course, the 1990 discussion whether the Asia miracle was inspiration or transpiration. And it seems that was everywhere has been transpiration. The convergence in income levels has been everywhere mostly, an investment and more human capital, but productivity, except one exception is the case. This is Sri Lanka, which I don't know very little, but it classifies emerging, and it has more. I had a 3 million people and $5,000 income per capita. So that makes India out, but it makes countries with some relative high level of income in 2010. And China is one of the, had the largest increase in productivity, okay? Poland and some countries. But in general, now, that hasn't been catch up. It doesn't mean that countries that are below have negative productivity growth. They have negative with respect to the US. This is if you see at countries. All countries, when I was doing this, I mailed my friends from other countries and I asked them. So all of them, they have an explanation for that country, okay? In the case of Chile, of course, we have done extremely well in terms of income, but we're about here in terms of productivity. There is a problem with the mining productivity, okay? Then you go to Uruguay and you find something with the use of capital, and then everywhere. And Mexico, I went carefully, and Mexico, you have that Mexico have negative productivity growth. Mexico is here, it's minus 0.9, okay? Year average negative growth on average since 1990. Now, I went to look at that data, and there are papers at the central bank, and they compute 0.6. So I think that overall, it's quite interesting. The case of Mexico is interesting because you say, well, they did everything that was needed. And they did NAFTA. So all Latin Americans were extremely envious of Mexico because we were not the neighbors of the empire. So, and being neighbor of the empire should have some benefit. Perhaps we were mistaken. But when you go, there are many stories for Mexico. Ones that work, one that doesn't work. The two main competing stories, one is China effect. The China effect means that when Mexico, at the same time that Mexico integrated with the US, that was the entry of China to the world economy and WTO. However, Mexico, since 1994 to today, export have gone from 5% of GDP, roughly, to 30% of GDP. So it's very difficult to tell a story that Mexico has some handicap in terms of trade. Okay, so however, there is a very big problem in Mexico of dualism, of a big dual economy, and that supposedly has increased over time. And you cannot say whether it was exactly due to NAFTA, but there has been huge growth in industry and export related to the US, but there is another sectors that become informal and crime and we know bad things about Mexico. So then I said, well, okay, let's try to dig closer and let's try to do development accounting, which is very simple development accounting. But it's one issue that I'm not so, you start from the production function and do what I did before. Basically, you say, let's divide GDP per capita in one country with respect to the US. Everything is done with respect to the US. Okay, let's do it with respect to the US and compute these shares. However, in the solo model, the capital labor ratio is endogenous to productivity. So productivity may go up, will increase the capital labor ratio, and we will be attributing that growth to capital labor and not to productivity. So a way that has been proposed that I'm not fully convinced because is to do capital output ratio, because the capital output ratio in the neoclassical growth model is independent of productivity. However, it depends on productivity growth. So that's not completely clear to me. But this is a standard Holland Jones, and then since then many people. So I said I will do the same, and then I'll do this as a checkup. So you compute capital output with the same data. The only thing that there is one thing, the relative productivity, you have to construct it from Penwell tables because Penwell table has productivity growth, real, but it has for 1 year, 2011, relative to the US for all countries. So from there you can construct the relative growth for the rest of the years. So this is the development accounting for a small sample of countries in Asia and Latin America without taking the all data from Penwell tables, without taking their shares, a common share, 65%, it doesn't make that much difference, labor share for emerging markets, and 35 for capital. And these are the results. And this is the countries in emerging Europe, Latin America, and Asia. Basically, what we have is that there has been convergence, very significant in Asia, moderate in Latin America, very significant in emerging Europe, okay, in 20 years. Capital has been relatively constant. This capital labor ratio is relatively high. Human capital has gone up. And TFP, the share, in some cases has gone up. In Latin America has gone down, depending on the number of countries. So, and the important thing is this. What explains the gap is almost 2/3 productivity. So the big, now if we change and we measure with this equation, this is the one that I use. If we measure with this one, we have that is about 50%, because this tends to give to capital some of the contribution of productivity if we believe that they are close to the state in the neoclassical growth model. But the bottom line is there hasn't been that much catch up in TFP, and still is a very large difference. So I think that then I can say, well, okay, so it's kind of surprising. And in the pre-conference, there was this discussion. I said, well, okay, what's happened? Because growth is not a continuous process. Countries do not grow at 3% for 50 years. They grow at 5 for 10 years, then they grow very little for others. So growth is quite a variable over time. So, and I tend to think that there is all this idea of growth accelerations. There are bursts of growth. So for some reason, most of the reason we know because some countries implement reforms, and there is a growth burst, and this is a growth acceleration. So it's okay, let's look at productivity growth within growth accelerations and compare to the normal periods. Okay, so I said, let's define a growth acceleration. This was done by Hausman, Pritchett, and Roderick many years ago, and it has been extended. And basically, I take the same with one difference. I take the same definition. They say if growth, per capita growth, this is per capita, is greater than conditions, 3.5%. So it's a relatively high rate of productivity growth. These are periods of 8 years. So 7 years growth, 8 years for GDP. Then you have, if growth have gone up, but by at least 2 percentage points. So we will call that a growth acceleration. And so in order to rule out periods in which are recovery from a deep recession, per capita GDP at the end of the episode may be equal to the maximum before the episode. So there's no recovery. Okay, so. And then you have to do some fancy things with the distance spline, and that's a MATLAB and all those things to pick the beginning of the year because you have too many. And what I did I said, because there are periods very long, you cannot say just 7 years. So what I did was basically to say, if growth continues being at least 2.5, because it decelerates, but it's at least 2.5, we will say the period has not ended. And then there is a definition for a sustainable and unsustainable. I have not much time, but so in unsustainable and sustainable, there is not that much difference for now. So unsustainable are the ones that end up with a crash. That's it. So what I did, I select the countries in the appendix, I compute, and then I say, okay, let's take for each country the contribution of TFP during the episode and the contribution of TFP during the whole sample, which goes from 1950 to 2014. It depends on the countries. Okay, so now what we see is that indeed productivity catch-up occurs in growth accelerations. So when there is real productivity growth, the contribution is much closer on average to 50, 60%, the contribution of productivity growth, and is closer to 30% when there is in the whole period. You'll see cases like Korea, that's here, I always change Korea. What's happening is that Korea is very close to the diagonal because Korea had a growth acceleration of almost 30 years. So it's almost the whole period, it's almost the same as the growth acceleration. So it's tricky, but this is quite clear for me that that productivity catch-up produces. So basically, I think that what I learned from this, there has been GDP income convergence, there has been TFP divergence, and the period of high productivity growth among emerging markets occur in periods of growth accelerations that basically are associated to labor reform. Some final things, I compute I start with this, the correlation, and the correlation between productivity growth in advanced economies at 10 years and 20 years have been growing over time. Even also the period of growth accelerations seems to be more associated with periods of high growth. There has been more growth accelerations in the early 90s in the commodity price boom and in the 70s, in the 60s before the commodity price boom. Just to finish, because I may have just 1 minute, opportunities are here. This was what I start working, but then I start going back and looking at the data. I think that the issues, there are some issues that are relevant for why productivity is not catching up, and what are the things relevant for today. First is interest rate. Interest rates that have come down. I just put Chile because we have indexed interest rate from a long time ago, from the 1990s. The decline in interest rate in advanced economies has been also happening in emerging economies. And this is important because the cost of investment is low. There is no growth, there won't be investment, but it's easy for emerging market economies. The second thing that is important is trade. Regarding trade, just one thing. We have learned from even work here at the Institute, we know about the stories that can explain the decline in trade and do not explain the decline of trade. And the decline of trade has to be with value changes, with but not with a protection and not with a somewhat slower growth. So I wouldn't say that will be a headwind for emerging market economy. Demographics, the demographic transition in emerging market is 10, 20 years later, almost the same as in advanced economies. Inequality is a problem everywhere in the world, and that's also creating problems for productivity and for good policies. And I think that the only graph is there has not been catch-up. Emerging markets are the red ones. most emerging markets are below advanced economies. It's the only thing that we don't catch up in being less corrupt. So, yeah, okay, I'm done.
So thank you for inviting me to discuss these very interesting papers. I think I need some help with, how did you? So I'll start with broad remarks, and the first one is that, as illustrated by José's paper, the productivity slowdown has been a global phenomenon affecting both advanced economies and emerging market economies. And I'll argue that this is more puzzling than might first meet the eye. Because this raises questions about maybe the international transmission of productivity. And I don't think we have good, I mean, we can speculate, but we don't have well-established theories of how at the low frequency, at the horizon of a decade, there should be transmission of a productivity slowdown between regions or group of countries that are at very different levels of economic development. And then there are policy implications, important policy implications from understanding what these channels of transmission are, whether they are related to trade or, for example, to finance. Now, I'm not going to focus to organize my discussion around the two papers. I'm going to take a broad view of what I think are the most important questions. And as I go along, I will touch upon the two papers. So this is a chart from a recent paper from the IMF staff. And the upper panel shows you real GDP per capita in advanced economies on the left-hand side, emerging market economies in the middle, and lower income countries on the right, around the global financial crisis. And the lower charts show you a decomposition of the output gap that you see on the top between different things, but in particular TFP, and TFP is the dark blue bar. And the striking fact here is that when you look at emerging market economies, you have this huge gap in TFP, which is much larger actually than for advanced economies. I mean, that's an important fact to have in mind when we think about the questions of this conference. So José's paper is related to that. He uses the same data as those underlying the previous chart, the Penworld tables, the last version, 9.0. And he looks at the correlation between TFP growth in advanced economies and in emerging market countries. And he highlights, I think, two important and very interesting facts. The first one is that if you look at TFP as it is measured in the Penworld tables, that is controlling for human capital accumulation and, of course, physical capital accumulation, actually there is no evidence of convergence between emerging market countries and advanced economies. On average, some countries converge sometimes, but on average, there is no strong evidence of convergence. And the second fact, which is very interesting, is that there is strong evidence of correlation between TFP growth between the two groups of countries. And not only at the high real business cycle frequency, but also over longer periods of time. So if in a given decade, TFP growth is lower in advanced economies, it will tend to be lower also in emerging market economies. So why is it interesting? Well, because it really runs counter the basic textbook model that we have in mind for that. So the basic textbook model is you have a world technology frontier. Their growth is determined by innovation. And then you have countries that are away from the world technology frontier, and they converge. And their growth is determined by different factors, which are more about diffusion and adoption of technologies than innovation. So if that model were true, we would expect to see convergence and not necessarily a lot of correlation between growth, because TFP growth in the two groups of countries are determined by different factors. And in fact, José shows that there is not much convergence, first. And second, there is correlation between GDP growth at the low frequency. So what's the right theory for that? What's the right model? And probably we would like to think of a model that has international transmission spillovers, but productivity spillovers between different groups of countries. So one can speculate. There could be a financial channel. So assume, for example, bank lending is important for TFP growth. And sometimes you have a banking crisis and you have contagion, so you have banking problems a little bit everywhere. Well, it's going to reduce TFP growth everywhere in advanced economies as well as less advanced economies to the extent that they are linked through banking. Or you could think of various trade channels. If you believe, for example, in learning by exporting, if for emerging market economies, if the demand coming from advanced economies is lower, then there will be less exporting, there will be less learning, there will be less TFP growth. Or it could be even more general than that. If you believe in models, and there are new models of that now, saying that TFP growth is endogenous to demand and not necessarily demand for exports, then when global demand is low, it's going to slow down TFP growth a little bit everywhere. In recent work, I try to distinguish between these different channels by doing a pretty simple exercise, which is regressing post-crisis TFP growth across countries on various measures of international economic integration, some related to trade, some related to finance. So for example, the idea was that if the channel is finance and banking, when I do this regression, I should find that the countries that are more integrated in banking should be more affected in terms of TFP growth by the crisis. Essentially, I found nothing. Essentially, I found that cross-country differences in TFP growth after the crisis are orthogonal to any measures of international integration, whether trade or finance, that I tried. So there is a puzzle there. I mean, you might say, well, that's a kind of kitchen sink regression one shouldn't do anymore. But you know, there is a puzzle about the channels. And this brings me to another approach, which is the approach in the paper by Filippo and Gianmarco, which is using much more granular data, firm-level data. And here, there is a large empirical literature with different branches based on these firm-level data, some of it looking at, for example, factor allocations, and the impact of the efficiency of factor allocation on TFP growth. Other branches looking more at exports, the impact of productivity on exports, the impact of exports on productivity, and so on. I'm not a contributor to that literature. I'm a consumer. I like this literature. One frustration I have a little bit as a macroeconomist is that often the papers in that literature do not go back from the firm-level data analysis to the aggregates, to the macro. And here I'm a little bit unfair. There are recent papers, and I'm citing them here, in particular coming from the IMF, which tries to do that, to go back from the firm-level analysis to the macro. But it seems to me that there should be much more work at this stage in that direction. That brings me to Filippo and Gianmarco's paper. I mean, Filippo presented it very clearly. I'm not going to repeat his presentation, but the main result you understood is that skewness is good. So you should like skewness in productivity distribution. because it's associated with higher allocative efficiency, which is the important thing. Also higher exports, but exports are not a goal in themselves. But here I have a little bit the same frustration as I expressed before. We want to talk about the productivity slowdown. So it's an aggregate productivity slowdown. How do we go from your analysis to that? So in particular, was there in your sample a productivity slowdown because the skewedness changed over time? How much of it would be explained by a change in skewness? I mean, these are questions I have in mind. Another question is, you sort of have the maintained assumption that the causality goes from productivity to exports, the kind of Melitz assumption. And that might be a good assumption for your sample. Maybe it's a good assumption for advanced economies. Maybe for less advanced economies, one should think also in terms of learning by exporting and causality from exports to productivity. And maybe you could say a little bit more about that. But my general point is, since the paper is not yet written, and so maybe it's a good time to think about how it's going to be written, I really would encourage you to sort of fill this gap between firm-level data analysis and aggregates in that paper. Now, let me come to the policy implications. So here, there is no puzzle about the channels of international transmission. We understand that lower productivity growth will lead to lower demand, lower levels of natural rates of interest, and that there might be international contagion in that simply because we live in a world that is integrated, both on the side of trade and finance. Then, since the global financial crisis, a number of new policy instruments have been used, some related to unconventional monetary policy, some to macroprudential policy, and there are many questions related to the use of the instruments, some related to the open economy dimension, like whether there is a case for more international coordination of these instruments. Now, I would like just to conclude, focus on one thing where I think I have something maybe more original to say, which is the nexus between macroprudential credit and global demand rebalancing. So, first fact, real interest rates have fallen. They have fallen everywhere, as we would expect, given the level of financial integration that we have. In fact, they have fallen by as much in emerging market economies as in advanced economies. So I'm showing you on the top nominal interest rates before the crisis, after the crisis. You see the advanced economies hitting the zero bound on the left. I separate Asia and non-Asia because this comes from a paper which was about secular stagnation in Asia. You don't see the nominal interest rates falling very much on average in Asia, but if you look at the real interest rates at the bottom, you see really a fall in real interest rates, which occurs everywhere and is as large in emerging market economies as in advanced economies. So a lot of symmetry here, and that's not puzzling. Where there is much more asymmetry is in credit, the credit gap. So I'm showing you the BIS measure of the credit gap, which is a deviation from a trend in credit, in the credit to GDP ratio. And you see advanced economies having a credit boom before the crisis, and then the bust. In emerging market economies, and especially in Asia, you see the boom after the crisis. And the boom by this measure is much larger than for advanced economies before the crisis. So you see advanced economies before the crisis had a credit gap a bit larger than 5%. Emerging market economies have a credit gap close to 15%. Now, macroprudential policy. Well, since the crisis, we have heard a lot about macroprudential policy, And we know that macroprudential policy should be used precisely to lean against these credit booms. So was macroprudential policy used? Well, this chart is showing you that, yes, it was used, and it was used where it should have been used, that is in emerging market economies. This is GDP weighted, so this reflects a lot China. And China is a country where you had a huge credit boom and also active use of macroprudential policy. And we sort of know why. China both pushed on the accelerator and the brake at the same time. So a credit stimulus, but then getting worried about excessive growth in some parts of the economy, so macroprudential restriction, credit moving elsewhere. And so both an active use of macroprudential policy and a credit boom. That's the last chart, and I'm relating this development in credits to demand rebalancing. So on the x-axis, I'm showing you the change in the current account balance between 2007 and 16, so after the crisis, a long period of time, almost 10 years, country by country. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you the change in the credit gap over the same period. And you have this negative relationship, which is very significant by the standards of international macro. And what is it saying? Well, if you look at the countries at the top and the left, these are countries that had current account surpluses before the crisis, and they reduced their current account surplus after the crisis, like China. So they had to shift demand from foreign demand to domestic demand. And the opposite on the other side of the chart. What this chart is telling you is that when you want to shift demand from foreign to domestic, at the same time, you have to create a lot of domestic credit. And China is very close to the regression line. So China is not exceptional in that regard. Is it puzzling? Maybe not. If you want to have if you want to stimulate demand, then you may want to increase credit. The lenders are going, the borrowers are going to spend more, but at the same time, due to Feldstein-Orioka, some of the saving is going to be domestic. So the net effect will not be that large, and in order to increase demand by 1%, you might need to increase credit by several percentage points, and here it's almost 4. If you reduce your current account balance by 1%, you increase your credit gap by about 4%. So just to conclude in less than 1 minute, this suggests to me a world in which maybe since the beginning of the 2000s, global demand tended to be too low. And demand has been supported by unsustainable credit boom somewhere. In the 2000s by credit boom in the US and some other countries, now in other regions. And this is not really taken care of by macroprudential policy. All right? So this is a problem for policy making in spite of macroprudential policy. And I'll stop here.
So thank you. As you all saw, this was a very fascinating discussion with lots of extremely interesting questions and unresolved issues. Let me, before I open up to questions from the audience, let me first turn to the our two presenters and see if they want to respond to some of the comments that Olivier has made in his remarks. And let me add to Olivier's comments just 2 points. One, a point on the very interesting paper presented by Filippo and Gianmarco on the relationship between the productivity slowdown and trade, which they conclude is ambiguous. And I guess my question there is, if it is ambiguous, there is a situation where the productivity slowdown actually leads to higher trade. How do we think about this in a context where trade in aggregate terms has always been associated with growth? I mean, would we have, how do we interpret, how do we think about this divergence? And for Jose, the obvious question, which you alluded to in the discussion of Mexico, is, what do we make of reforms in emerging markets in a context where TFP, this very depressing result that you showed, that TFP growth has always actually lagged, and lagged by a lot, TFP growth in advanced economies. Meanwhile, emerging markets have been, adopting a lot of different reforms over the years, and they seem to have had little to no effect. So how do we think about that? Please.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot, Olivier, for the comments. Just a couple of remarks on this divarication macro micro, and the way we are really trying to work out this differentiation. First of all, I think that the paper that actually we presented was in fact an attempt to do that. So again, we using data which are macro data, sort of aggregated trade bilateral data, and we kind of postulate that you can actually associate this with a deeper sort of comprehension of what's going on at the macro structural level. So I think that's one attempt. Of course, it's an initial attempt, but that's actually the way we could go on, adding countries, doing international attempt to do this. So that's basically one line of research that I think we should pursue further. But sort of to go more into an additional point on how we use this data, being in fact many of us macro-born people. I'll give you two examples of how we use this first of all, we have an ambition actually to make sure that more and more firm-level analysis and data are used in parallel with macro aggregated information. So right now, for instance, we are discussing with the European Commission how we can they have their set of surveillance indicators, normally are very aggregated, so current account deficit, unit labor cost and so on. So we want to have more information. And then for that, for instance, issues related to labor cost, for instance. We can say a lot of things. I mean, now, say in Europe in general, you look at unit labor cost aggregated. But if you go into the firm level, you realize in certain countries that in a sense there is not a problem for the whole economy, but certain part of the economy. So say the least productive firms are the ones that maybe have sort of wages out of control rather than the whole economy. So these are important information that again have a value also for the macro analysis. I can also add that, on the financial constraint front, you were actually mentioned before, we can also there make a differentiation when there is an issue of financial needs or financial constraints, say after the crisis. Do we know what's going on? Yes. Now we are able to actually to see before and after the crisis whether the financial constraint issue is something that was corrected or not, and if the bank are actually doing a cleansing, of their previous policies that you were mentioning before, of over-lending, presumably. So in the sense that what I'm saying is that there is a lot of value also for macro analysis on just even getting stylized facts out of the information that we got. Thanks.
Yeah, regarding the comments, I think that Olivier put it very well. He said there are two issues separate, but they go together, which is no convergence and high correlation. And so there is a big, important issue about diffusion and what makes diffusion cyclical around the world, and discussion about trade and credit. Anyway, that I get a little bit more, I think that to some extent, and this is a deeper issue about productivity, the correlation many times could be also a problem of measurement and changing in utilization during the business cycle. So I'm much more impressed by the non-convergence, and that there is some convergence in period of growth burst. And what triggers that, I think that there is some evidence that is reforms, trade reforms, stabilization. So countries, sometimes they behave well. Now, that's kind of obvious, and that has happened many times. The question is what makes a country that has reached some reasonable level of income to really have another growth acceleration. And I think that that's, we know very little. So my basic way to see this is that countries with all the big first order distortions they have, they are growing, they're producing much below their potential. So this growth acceleration is because you just remove those distortions and countries grow to their potential. But then it's how you move their potential and how their potential catches up the potential of the world and advanced economies. And that has to be, in my view, much more with institutions and the way how economies work than kind of things on the cycle and macro.
Yes, I'm going back to some of the questions that Olivier asked, and you also asked that have not been replied. So the first, I think that the important point that Olivier raised was that what actually do we learn from all this firm-specific information about the aggregate? So what is our work telling us about the aggregate productivity slowdown, and how you can feel a little bit the gap between macro and macro? So maybe you've noticed in the tables that Neil has shown, but also in some of the graphs that we've seen in the next presentation, it was quite easy to spot one country that was always at the top or the bottom of this graphs, of these tables. That was Italy. I mean, also on the bad part of the ranking, meaning that while it was doing not pretty badly in the pictures, because the pictures were about the productivity slowdown, so how much Italy slowed down with respect to, say, 10 or 15 years ago, and that was doing, frankly, pretty well, simply because it slowed down 20 years ago and has now remained flat for 20 years. So an interesting analysis of the productivity slowdown, or what we can learn about from the firm-level data, is probably looking at the case of Italy. And the case of Italy is showing something interesting, that is, in these 20 years, there is something that is becoming worse and worse, which is the allocation of resources across firms in different sectors and across regions or areas within the country. And some back-of-the-envelope calculation is showing that if we had kept in Italy the same quality of allocative efficiency we had in the 90s, mid-90s, until now, then Italian productivity would have been 18% higher, which, given that the general slowdown of productivity is what we are talking about, well, 18% higher, of course, is over 20 years. Is not that bad. So one point you can get out of this analysis, that precisely when you have a productivity slowdown, then the allocative efficiency, so how resources move around the macroeconomic structure, so the different firms, becomes more and more important. So in a sense, when you have a slowdown, then how those that are moving a little bit are getting, how much they're getting of the resources become much more important. So this is something that can bridge a gap between macro and macro. Another point that you raised that is quite important is everything we have presented is productivity to trade, but clearly there is also the reverse causality, or the reverse relation from trade to productivity, and learning by exporting, and therefore the implications of maybe protectionism or some retreat from globalization in terms of the productivity slowdown. There, I mean, this is an open issue in terms of the international trade literature. So there were two waves of analysis. The first was looking at the effects of learning by exporting, mainly in developed countries, and there was not much there in terms of trade causing more productivity. But then when you think about learning, you typically learn from people that know things better or do things better than you do. And if you compare, say, if you take the US and you look at whether trade with other countries is teaching the US something, if you assume the US are on the frontier of best practices, clearly there's not much to be learned. So this may explain why those studies didn't find much. And the second wave is more about developing countries or countries that are not technological leaders. And there you see evidence of learning by exporting. Finally, you had a point, Monica, on, well, can productivity slowdown be associated with more trade? Again, the micro approach is telling you that there are these two things going on. One is a general rise in productivity as everybody, and the other is a growth in size of the big firms. And so it may well be that even if productivity is slowing down, you observe more trade, simply because the big firms are becoming bigger and bigger and possibly more dominant. And this is opening up, of course, the Pandora box of market power and in a global and local economy.
Thank you very much. So let me now open to, we have time for a few questions from the floor. And let me ask you to, we have a roving mic and a mic in the back. Let me ask you all to please just state your name and affiliation when you ask a question. German.
German Zettelmeier, Peterson Institute. So I have 3 questions. The first to Gianmarco and Filippo, which expands directly on what Gianmarco just said. So to what extent do you actually see, I don't know how far your data goes back, but to what extent can you actually see the productivity slowdown at the firm level in your data set? And if so, does it go along, like Olivier asked in his presentation, with an increase in skewness or not? Because then, indeed, you could possibly, project this forward and then come up with some implications of the slowdown for the volume of trade. To Jose and Olivier, so, at the end of the day, Jose, do you view the slowdown of productivity growth in emerging economies as a predominantly homegrown phenomenon, or is a spillover from advanced countries? So it's an incredibly difficult question, but what is your feeling? Because we have these, middle income growth trap stories that are really all homegrown, but I did identify some spillovers. And finally, Olivier, on your sort of credit growth rebalancing story, it's very compelling. Do you have a sense on whether this is actually caused by what happened in advanced countries? So is this an implication of slowing productivity and lower interest rates? Or is it something else, like financial development, for example, in emerging markets? There could be several stories.
Let's take some questions, a couple more questions from the back before we open.
So Carolyn Freund from the Peterson Institute. Thanks for the interesting presentations. My question is for Filippo and Gianmarco. So one way to think about the link between trade and productivity is the reverse causality that Gianmarco mentioned. And we know that trade surged in the period before the financial crisis, period of hyper-globalization, creation of global value chains. And that had huge implications for allocative efficiency because the more productive firms grew bigger, less productive firms got pushed out by competition, et cetera. So the productivity growth during that period may have been associated with growing trade, and in the current period of trade slowdown, it could be that is depressing trade, and that would also explain why it's correlated around the world. So I was wondering, and as Jeremy asked, if your data's long enough to look at whether that story holds any water. And then finally, in terms of the skewness, did you look at, there's a literature on the importance of large firms. Did you look at whether the productivity of the top firm or top few firms was correlated with the kind of revealed comparative advantage from the gravity equations? Thank you.
So let's take one more question in this round.
Thank you, Peter Fisher of the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth, and thank you all again for the presentations. You've really inspired me to be haunted by a more basic question about the relationship between R and G. And as often happens in the international equation, we introduce boundaries and jurisdictions, and we can see some things going on. So I wonder, I just want your reaction to the thought that we're trying to find causes of the rate of productivity growth, and there are three places we need to look: those unrelated to the cost of capital, those related to the cost of capital, and those that are somehow just about the diffusion of productivity unrelated to the cost of capital. And then we have the causes of the level of interest rates, and they're ones that are unrelated to the rate of productivity, and the ones that are related to the rate of productivity, and the ones that are just in the distribution of capital. So we've got the relationship between R and G can be teased out into each of those 6 subcategories, and that's a mouthful, but you're all hinting darkly at problems in which way the causation runs, and I want you to try to address that directly.
No.
So I take quickly the first question of Jerome and partly Caroline. Our data set is actually relatively recent. I mean, for those countries that we have data are starting about 2000 or until 2000. Actually, we have 12. So we are running a new exercise. So we will have 2014 and 15 soon. So the only thing we could do is actually we were some heads on from Olivier. So we just ran a few sort of overtime. And I will be able to distribute this chart additional just for your information. But basically what we have, a few stylized facts that we got. First of all, the evolution of the coefficient between export and productivity is actually after the crisis starting increasing a bit after the crisis. So that is what we have was relatively constant before, and now in our data you will see that this is actually going up across years. The other things that we are actually finding out again from this data is that the OP gap, in fact, if anything, has a bit decreased. Yeah, sorry. The OP gap has been decreasing slightly over time. And one last thing that we got was that there is, in fact, a bit of the departure before and after the crisis. If we look at the correlation between the dispersion and efficiency. So the dispersion and efficiency tend to actually decline after the crisis. So it's something that, again, very initial information, but the data set is relatively short for this. But
that's something. No, yeah, it's but regarding, it's a very difficult question. What does Jerome mean? I would like to know whether slowdown is a spillover or homegrown. When I start this, I start thinking about spillovers, but then when you see that there is a general stagnation, I think that there is a homegrown, there are some cyclicality or correlation with the global economy, so I don't think it's so. Yeah, that's.
Okay, so for the other questions by Caroline. So these issues of reverse causality, and also the other question about causality in general. In this debate of whether trade causes GDP growth or productivity growth or vice versa, it's really a long-standing debate in aggregate trade. And I think it's not been settled yet. What people are trying to do, and this is, again, you can do that more at the micro level than at the macro level, is to look for natural experiments and see whether, in that case, you can find something that is like an exogenous shock to trade, and then you see it, what is the outcome in terms, for example, of productivity. There are several channels through which this may happen. It may be learning by trade or by exporting. It could be a competitive pressure that is pushing firms to be less complacent with the status quo. It could be reallocation. I mean, simply once you have larger markets, and this is what Caroline was hinting at, then you have firms that are able to enjoy the access to these markets while suffering a little bit the competition that is coming from these additional from competitors from these additional markets, and firms that cannot do that simply because they are too small or not productive enough, and so they only suffer the competition effect of imports. So, and this is precisely what Caroline was suggesting, is that before the crisis, trade surged a lot. You had these markets opening up, and I mean, that created a sort of selection and sorting, with big firms able to expand and the other firms really not, well, suffering possibly. So this issue of reverse causality is hard to really settle, except with sort of national experiments or other IV strategies that are sometimes quite debatable. In terms of the skewness, so there was this question whether we actually can see that the productivity of top firms is correlated with comparative advantage or with changes in trade, or what is driving trade. This is something we should look at a little bit more at. I mean, in the cross-section, this seems to be the case. But, I mean, the time dimension is a little bit more complicated for the data sets that we have. I mean, Filippo has already mentioned something, but we didn't look at the evolution of comparative advantage. I have a general comment on this. I think that, I mean, and this is why the comment by Jan was very well taken. I think there is, so far, there is surprising little work that is really trying to address the question of whether this access to big data at the macro level should affect our understanding of the big concepts at the macro level in terms of trade. So I'm just thinking in terms of comparative advantage. I can think only of a couple of papers, and notably one, that has really looked at whether firm heterogeneity and what we know about firm heterogeneity should affect our understanding of comparative advantage. So whether this sort of selection effects and reallocation effects should affect the way we measure and understand the evolution of revealed comparative advantage. So this is, I think it's really a challenge, and it's for frontier research, and should be addressed, even in terms of our understanding of gravity equations. Trade elasticity, now we have several papers that try to show us that this information at the firm level is important to understand the reaction of aggregate trade flows to trade policy changes, meaning that the elasticity that we actually measure in the data that is mapping the shock to the trade changes may be affected by the heterogeneity of firms. But things like the one that we are trying to do, whether the ability of a country to export defined as a fixed exporter effects in the gravity equation is affected by firm heterogeneity, is something that I've not really found much about. So I think this is really an open issue. Finally, in terms of the behavior of top firms, going back to the Italian case, one thing that we see actually in the data is that the sectors and the areas that are suffering more from increased misallocation are those that are exposed, have been exposed the most to frontier shocks. So what are frontier shocks for, I mean, how you measure that? So the idea, this is a literature that Olivier has cited. So this idea that there are firms that are close to the frontier and firms that are far from the frontier. Then you may have a shock at the frontier, and these two types of firms may react very differently. Those that are close may have an incentive to move with the frontier, and those that are far away, they simply don't care. So you have this stretching of the support of the productivity distribution, which is creating additional pressure on reallocation. And what you can see that this is something that happens to be there in the data in the case of Italy. If you measure the shift of the frontier as investment in R&D that varies across sectors. So in sectors in which there's been more investment at the frontier, meaning more investment in R&D in the US considered as the best practice, then in Italy, in those sectors, you see a bigger increase in misallocation and this stretching of the distribution. So there is something about big firms, there is something about the frontier shifting and a lot of firms that are not keeping up with the frontier. But again, I mean, this is just a preliminary analysis on the Italian case.
Well, thank you very much. I think this has been an extremely fascinating discussion. It is my pleasure now to, well, I guess Adam will invite us all for lunch.
Thank you. As you know, inviting people to lunch is one of my great pleasures as president of the Institute. Before doing so, I'd just like to say thank you again to this panel, which